Hello class, this is the chapter summaries for chapters 9 through 12. So I'm going to go very quickly. I'm actually not going to read this because I actually want you to try to piece together the summary through the actual reading of the novel. So we're going to go ahead and jump right in. So in chapter 9, we are finding that Cecil Jacobs begins to taunt Scout for because Atticus is representing Tom Robinson, an African American, in a trial. So basically, we'll go ahead and pick up from there. You can just take that back, boy. This order, given by me to Cecil Jacobs, was the beginning of a rather thin time for Jem and me. My fists were clenched, and I was ready to let fly. Atticus had promised me he would wear me out if he ever heard of me fighting any more. I was far too old and too big for such childish things, and the sooner I learned to hold in, the better off everybody would be. I soon forgot. Cecil Jacobs made me forget. He had announced in the schoolyard the day before that Scout's Finch's daddy defended N-words. I denied it, but told Jem. What'd he mean saying that? I asked. Nothin', said Jem. Ask Atticus, he'd tell you. Do you defend N-words, Atticus? I asked him that evening. Of course I do. Don't say that word, Scout. That's common. So we'll continue on. You're going to read a little bit on your own as to why Cecil says that in particular. So keep that in mind as you read. And I'm going to just close out, make sure I don't get any notifications. Okay, so you're going to go ahead and read through a little bit more. This one's mine, I guess. You might hear some ugly talk about it at school, but do one thing for me, if you will. And this is Atticus telling Scout. You just hold your head high and keep those fists down. No matter what anybody says to you, don't you let 'em get your goat. Try fighting with your head for a change. It's a good one, even if it does resist learning. If it does resist learning. So he's trying to tell his daughter, don't fight because of people talking bad about him and this trial. So let's continue on. Somehow, if I fought Cecil, I would let Atticus down. And there was another instance where Cecil wants to he begins taunting Scout, but this time Scout actually doesn't choose to fight him. Atticus so rarely asked Jem and me to do something for him. I could take being called a coward for him. I felt extremely noble for having remembered and remained noble for 3 weeks. Then Christmas came and disaster struck. So now we're moving on to a Christmas story. I'm going to kind of paraphrase this for the sake of time because I only get 15 minutes. This basically talks about how Scout, Jem, and Atticus spend time with their auntie and uncle Jimmy. And then there's a certain grandson named Francis, that's Auntie Alexandra's grandson, who comes. And Jem and Scout both do not like him at all. This boy, Francis, you'll find out why. He's not the best well-behaved kid. You're going to read this on your own. You learn a little bit more about the family dynamic that goes on. This is really funny actually because this part talks about how Scout is beginning to cuss, not cuss bad, but like saying damn and saying hell because she's trying to convince her dad, Atticus, that she doesn't have to be in school, that she's picking up these bad habits at school. So it's just a fun part to read. Let's continue on. Like I said, I am having to skip through a lot. When we arrived at the landing, and this is where they go for Christmas, Alexandra kissed Uncle Jack, Francis kissed Uncle Jack, Uncle Jimmy shook hands silently with Uncle Jack. Jem and I gave our presents to Francis, who gave us a present. Jem felt his age and gravitated to the adults, leaving me to entertain our cousin. Francis was 8 and slicked back his chair. So this is where you're going to begin to read how poorly behaved this kid is. You're going to read that on your own. Francis hooted. What's the matter with him? I asked. Ain't anything the matter with him? You mean that little runt Grandma says stays with Miss Rachel every summer? And this is where Francis is talking about Dill. And obviously, Scout feels very strongly that there's nothing the matter with Dill. That's exactly who I mean. I know all about him, said Francis. What about him? Grandma says he hasn't got a home. Has too, this is Scout saying. He lives in Meridian. He just gets passed around from relative to relative, and Miss Rachel keeps him every summer. Francis, that's not so. Francis grinned at me. You're mighty dumb sometimes, Jean Louise. Guess you don't know any better, though. And then they continue to bicker, and this is where Scout gets very upset. This is Frances saying, I guess it ain't your fault if Uncle Atticus is an N-word lover besides, but I'm here to tell you it certainly does mortify the rest of the family. Frances, what the hell do you mean? Just what I said. Grandma says it's bad enough. He lets you all run wild, but now he's turned out an N-word lover. We'll never be able to walk the streets of Maycomb again. He's ruined the family. That's what he's doing. And that's where Scout loses it. She loses it to the point, and I'm going to have you read this on your own. I want you to tell me what she does to him. At the very end, she does get caught by her uncle, and her uncle disciplines her, but doesn't really hear her sigh, so she feels very upset about that. And at the very end, you're going to read a little bit about the Yules and Tom Robinson. And this is the last part we're going to read. And this is Atticus talking to his brother, Jack, about the trial. Right, but do you think I could face my children otherwise? You know what's going to happen as well as I do. Jack and I hope and pray I can get Jem and Scout through without bitterness, and most of all, without catching Maycomb's usual disease. Why reasonable people go stark raving mad when anything involving an N-word comes up is something I don't pretend to understand. I just hope that Jem and Scout come to me for their answers instead of listening to the town. I hope they trust me enough. Jean Louise, this is where she gets caught eavesdropping and she gets sent to bed, but this is really good commentary of Atticus's heart towards this trial. Now we're moving on to chapter 10, so let's move on. This is a very short chapter, and I'm going to talk about this pretty short in a quick manner. Basically, which we'll read right now, Atticus's kids feel that Atticus is feeble, old, obsolete. He was nearly 50 when Jem and I asked him why he was so old. He said he got started late, which we felt reflected upon his abilities and manliness. He was much older than the parents of our school contemporaries, and there were nothing Jem and I could say about him when our classmates said my father. Basically, Jem and Scout don't think their dad is cool. They think that he is very old for his age. This is a very important quote. This talks about mockingbirds and why not to kill a mockingbird. For the sake of time, read this on your own. It's very important, and it is a question on homework. But basically, there is going to be a dog with rabies that comes up. His name's Jim Johnson, and we're going to read a little bit, or I'm sorry, not Jim Johnson, I mean Tim Johnson right here. And he's a dog on the loose, and he's obviously, when a dog has rabies, they're literally sick. They wobble around. They're unpredictable. They can bite and attack. And Calpurnia sees the dog from afar, and she calls Atticus to come, and so he does. And Atticus and Mr. Tate, who is our just like policeman, officer of the town, the sheriff of the town, come. And this is a really interesting, kind of creepy description. Tim Johnson, which is the dog with rabies, was advancing at a snail's pace. But he was not playing or sniffing at foliage. He seemed dedicated to one course and motivated by an invisible force that was inching him toward us. We could see him shiver like a horse shedding flies. His jaw opened and shut. He was a list, but he was being pulled gradually toward us. He's looking for a place to die, said Jem. Mr. Tate turned around. He's far from dead, Jem. He hasn't got started yet. This is an interesting part. This is actually where Mr. Tate hands the rifle off to Atticus, and Mr. Tate says he can't quite see, and he has Atticus shoot the dog, and which really is surprising to the kids, because remember, at the beginning of the chapter, they don't think Dad's cool, right? Well, guess what? I'm not going to tell you what happens. I want you to read it on your own. There's a few places for you to read in the pink. Sorry, I don't mean to scroll so fast, but I want you to read what the outcome is of this shooting, with Atticus shooting the dog, okay? Chapter 11, we're moving right along. So, chapter 11 is a little bit of a longer chapter. Mrs. Dubose is a new character that gets introduced, and we find out that one, she's a really, really mean lady, and two, she is dealing with a sort of ailment. So we're going to actually read that together, okay? So, previous minor encounters with her left me with no desire for more, but Jem said I had to grow up sometime. They're referring to Mrs. Dubose. Mrs. Dubose lived alone except for an N-word girl in constant attendance, 2 doors up the street from us in a house with steep front steps and a dog trot hall. She was very old. She spent most of each day in bed and the rest of it in a wheelchair. It was rumored that she kept a CSA pistol concealed among her numerous shawls and wraps. Jem and I hated her. She was on the porch. When we passed, we would be raked by her wrathful gaze, subjected to ruthless interrogation regarding our behavior, and given a melancholy prediction on what we would amount to when we grew up, which was always nothing. So anytime they pass, you guys, she's constantly just reaming at them, saying things like, which we'll read right now, telling them that your father's no better than the N-words and trash he works for. This sets off Jem, okay? And he actually uses one of Scout's batons, and he, which you will read, obliterates her petunias and her yard, and totally makes it a point to trash her entire yard, which you will read over here. Sorry, I went a little too fast. Oops. And time is not up. Sorry, that was my timer. Sorry about that. You will notice that because he obliterates her yard, she asks for Jem to read to her every day. So every day for a month. And as they go and read to her, and this is the part that I want you to really kind of focus in on, she is actually dealing with withdrawals, okay? So I want you to take the time to read through. I need to make this video, make sure it fits in the 15-minute slot, but you're going to read what it's like for somebody to go through withdrawals. And we find out later that she was a morphine addict. Yeah, she was addicted to morphine, and she wanted to be free from her addiction, and she ends up passing away. And that's the end of that chapter, guys. I know I am zooming through. Hopefully that helps you answer those questions. Last but not least, before we finish out the weekend, is chapter 12. All it is Calpurnia takes them to church, and there's some drama that goes on. So we'll go ahead and skip through. Well, two things before I move on. Jem is getting older, doesn't really want to be around his sister. Dill does not plan to come back this summer, so that's a sad thing for Scout. And we move on to where Calpurnia gets them ready for church. They get to church, and there's this woman named Lula who does not like Caucasians, white folks. She gets on Calpurnia for bringing them, but then there's other people that defend Jem and Scout, and they're told to not be to discriminate them, and so Lula does leave, but they're embraced by the whole church because of Atticus. And you'll read that the Reverend actually mentions this church has no better friend than your daddy. So as you can tell, the African American community has definitely embraced Scout and Jem. And at the very end, you're going to read that there is somebody unexpected at the front door of Scout and Jem. So I know I skipped through a lot. I hope this helps you answer those questions. So please make sure you read this before you read, all right? Have a great weekend, guys.